There you go. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. All right, thanks to Adrian for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present today. So I'm going to be talking about the distribution of physical particle injection pumps in the Southern Ocean. This is work that I have been doing closely with Lily Dove, who's a former graduate student at Caltech. She's actually off to do a postdoc at Brown University with Mara Freilich. But of course, it's involved a lot of other collaborators as well, and those are listed here. Okay, so I'll keep the introduction relatively short, thinking about the importance of the Southern Ocean, and in particular carbon export in the climate system. This is a really nice schematic from Adele Morrison's review paper on Southern Ocean ventilation. So you're looking at depth latitude plots of the climatology of apparent oxygen utilization. So low values here represent recently ventilated waters. The Indo-Pacific sector is on the left, the Atlantic sector is on the right. And so what's interesting about the Southern Ocean, you have a large range of density classes that either outcrop at the surface or are ventilated. And you can see that there are these very clear pathways for surface waters into the interior. This has a lot to do with the circulation, but as we'll see, we want to understand the coupling here between the physical circulation and spatial variations in productivity in the upper ocean. This is a nice schematic here that I won't talk about too much. That also is from Adele's paper, just pointing out that you have these multiple pathways into the mode and intermediate water classes that are largely subducted and spread to lower latitudes. And those can involve both adiabatic or long density surface pathways or dipycnal processes. And of course, the sinking fluxes move through that as well. So one of the real challenges for understanding how the physics are impacting carbon export in the Southern Ocean is that there's just a lot of spatial heterogeneity in what I'm sort of broadly calling here ocean turbulence. So here's one way of looking at this. I'm showing a distribution of eddy kinetic energy that comes from using satellite altimetry. So this is looking at velocities that are resolving the mesoscales. And you can see there's already 4 orders of magnitude in variability here. And you can see this distribution is really patchy. In particular, there are regions in the lee of major topographic features where you have very high eddy kinetic energy. And I'll talk about one of those regions a little bit later on. But I very specifically use this broad term ocean turbulence because even though we're not resolving smaller, say, submesoscale turbulence using altimetry, we do know that the mesoscale really strongly shapes those smaller scales through mesoscale stirring. And as we'll see, there's also a lot of spatial variability in the submesoscales as well. So we've done a number of fieldwork programs over the last few years looking at different regions in the Southern Ocean. I'm just going to focus on 2 today, this number 4, which is a high eddy kinetic energy region in the Indian sector, and then some work we did with Philip Boyd and colleagues south of Tasmania a couple of years ago. And so then one other figure of introduction, I really like this figure. It comes from a recent paper by Tomala and colleagues based on some work they did previously. In the first panel here, they're introducing a diagnostic called seasonal cycle reproducibility. So in certain regions where there's a very pronounced seasonal cycle, the idea is that dynamics are relatively stationary from year to year. But there are other regions where this seasonal cycle reproducibility is much weaker, as shown in blue. Which is attributed to, it could be synoptic variability coming from storms, but it may also be the impact of more intermittent variability in the ocean from, say, meso and submesoscales. And you can see you get this really interesting, almost banded structure, low values in the marginal ice zone and in the frontal regions, redder values elsewhere. And what's really nice in this paper is I say you need to take this, which is one picture of how the physics varies, physics and biogeochemistry varies, and map it onto the biological properties. And in particular here, we're looking at surface chlorophyll values. And if you take those 2 plots together, you get the one on the right, which is essentially breaking down the Southern Ocean into a number of different biogeochemical and physical regimes. And even with these 4 sort of simple regimes, low and high surface chlorophyll, low and high seasonal cycle reproducibility, you see this very intricate spatial distribution of these regimes. And we expect that carbon export will be very sensitive to these different properties. And so it raises the question, where are physical particle injection pumps active in the Southern Ocean? And even from sort of these early observational studies, how do we begin to interpolate those to larger circumpolar scales? And then in places where the physics may be important for carbon export, which ones are going to be dominant in the Southern Ocean and how do they interact with each other? So I'll just introduce, I've sort of mentioned that we're going to look at the impact of physics on carbon export. Here's a nice schematic from the review paper by Phil Boyd and colleagues, looking at various different pumps. You have your biological gravitational pump. You may also have a number of more active pumps. Some are biologically mediated, such as the mesopelagic migrant pump, the seasonal lipid pump. But today I'm going to focus on what I call physically mediated pumps, the mixed layer pump or the eddy subduction pump. Now, both of these are very strongly tied to upper ocean variability, mixed layer variability, and density distributions in the upper ocean. I am sure that many on the call will be familiar with these different processes, but I'll just give a very quick background on them. So the mixed layer pump can be estimated from, or the export flux of POC due to the mixed layer pump can be estimated from time series of POC concentrations and mixed layer depth variability. The idea here is if you have a certain amount of particular organic carbon in the mixed layer, if that mixed layer shoals over time, it will leave that POC behind. And if that, as long as that POC sinks and is no longer re-entrained by subsequent mixed layer deepening, that counts as an export of POC. If the mixed layer deepens, then you have re-entrainment. And following the relationships in the Dall'Omo and Boll papers, we have a relatively simple expression here for that export flux, which involves the integral of POC over some time rate of change of that mixed layer depth. Now, that mixed layer depth can vary over a range of timescales, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Typically, this has been calculated on seasonal timescales. We're going to look at it at a slightly higher frequency. The eddy subduction pump is a little bit more complicated because unlike the mixed layer pump, which you can think about as a one-dimensional process, the eddy subduction pump takes into account the idea that you can have upper ocean density gradients, and one needs to know something about the horizontal variability of both the upper ocean density and the distribution of, for example, POC. But we do have ways of estimating. Oh, and I should say that, so the eddy subduction pump is associated with the idea that when you have these upper ocean fronts or density gradients, there is a tendency through a number of processes, but the one we think about the most is mixed layer baroclinic instability, for that density front to slump over or relax. And there's a tendency for particulate matter on the dense side of that front to be carried into the interior. So again, we're thinking here about a flux, which involves a correlation here between vertical velocities and concentration. And it's important to keep in mind that these processes involve both downwelling and upwelling velocities. And although it's hard to measure these directly, we do have ways of parameterizing them. So the relationship I show in the red box here is one parameterization for how one represents these vertical fluxes. And it can be estimated if you have information about upper ocean POC concentrations and both information about the horizontal and the lateral stratification. So down below, I'm introducing buoyancy there, which is proportional to density. M squared and N squared are the horizontal and vertical density gradients respectively. And you also need information about the mixed layer depth. And then I'll just point out that there is this parameter gamma here, which is the ratio of M squared to N squared, which is equivalent to the isopycnal slope. And it's the slope of these isopycnals that can have a really strong impact on how deep this particulate matter can be carried into the interior through the eddy subduction pump. Okay, and then just one more slide before I jump into results. I'm going to talk briefly about two field programs today. Both of them made use of Lagrangian platform, namely profiling floats, but then using ocean gliders to provide some spatial context around those floats. So here's one example from the SOLAS study south of Tasmania. The small squares that you can see there are the location where the float was profiling roughly once per day. You can see that the trajectory sort of starts at the top and moves in a counterclockwise sense. And then we use the glider, as shown by the circles here, to sort of sample around the float, and in particular, trying to sample perpendicular to the float's trajectory to sort of capture the density structure associated with the geostrophic flow. And I will just mention that, in the absence of having the ability to deploy autonomous vehicles or have a ship there, satellite altimetry, or remote sensing in general, I should say, can be really effective ways of helping to understand spatial context. So here's an interesting snapshot. I'll show this later on, using a property called finite size Lyapunov exponents, which actually highlights strong straining regions. This is for that same SOLAS region. You can see the two cyclonic eddies and the anticyclonic eddy labeled there. And so you can see in this region that there's a lot of interesting small scale structure that happens even in this even in the small region. Okay, so the first thing I want to focus on is this high eddy kinetic energy region. I'm going to talk about a field program called SOGO, Southern Ocean Glider Observations of Submesoscales, that was focused on subduction in these high eddy kinetic energy regions. So the region we targeted here was an area called the Southwest Indian Ridge. You can see the bathymetry on the upper right. There is a fracture zone in the Southwest Indian Ridge that really pins the position of the polar front. So those black contours you see in the upper right are the climatological positions of the ACC front, and the polar front goes right through this domain. So the polar front is very strongly localized to that fracture zone, but then in the lee, you get a very strong standing meander, and then there's quite a bit of variability. And so in this lower left-hand panel here, you see a map of the eddy kinetic energy distribution. And what we attempted to do in the study was to deploy 2 gliders to actually track one of SOCOM's bio-Argo floats. We were in a region with a very strong both background mean flow and strong variability. So this was a little bit challenging. We had surface velocities close to a meter per second. However, what we were able to do in the study is sort of look at a transition between what are the properties we're seeing in terms of exchange between the surface ocean and the interior in this very high eddy kinetic energy, high strain region. And then as these platforms drifted downstream, moving into a region where the eddy kinetic energy was weaker, and equivalently, the strain rates were weaker as well. So the first thing I want to show is what just the observations look like as you transition between these 2 different regimes. If you look at the upper panel, you have depth on the y-axis, you have distance along the trajectory of just one of the gliders or along the track of one of the gliders. And the bars up above are sort of indicating where this high eddy kinetic energy and strain region is, and then the downstream low eddy kinetic energy and strain region. So in the high EKE regions, you see a couple things. You can see actually, you see different water masses. So you can see regions where the surface water is warm and the ocean is temperature stratified. These are waters north of the polar front, and they're very strongly interacting with waters where you can see a temperature minimum at about 200 to 400 meters depth, which is indicative of intermediate water. The contours that you see here are density surfaces, and the places where those density surfaces are displaced vertically, where they bowl up or bowl down, are associated with the mesoscale features that we're sampling with the glider. And then you can see that even at scales smaller than the mesoscale, you see this very intricate variability in the temperature anomalies here. And those are largely linked to the periphery or the edges of where these mesoscale features are. As you move further downstream, you can still see some mesoscale variability, but you can see that small finer scale variability is much, much weaker. The middle and lower panels are essentially emphasizing the same things. The middle panel shows an anomaly of spice on different density surfaces that are then mapped back to their mean depth. So spice is essentially looking at variance, compensated temperature and salinity variance on density surfaces. So this is a good measure or proxy for isopycnal stirring. And again, you see that that's enhanced in the high eddy kinetic energy region. And then as you go down to the lowermost panel, we're again showing now apparent oxygen utilization mapped onto different density surfaces and then plotted as a function of the mean depth of that density surface. And the thing that really stands out here is the very fine scale variability that you see in AOU, again, low values of waters that have been recently ventilated, but also seeing that in these high eddy kinetic energy and high strain regions, you have a really extremely deep penetration of these low AOU values into the interior, to depths almost down to 600 meters in ways that you really don't see as you move further downstream. So now we zoom into what's happening near the surface ocean. Now I'm just showing 2 subsets of the time series, again, from the high EKE and strain region and the low region. The upper panels are showing ADT, so absolute dynamic topography, or just sea surface height mapped onto the position of the glider. So you can see those mesoscale anomalies in the upper panel, and you can see them mirrored by displacement in the density surfaces below. And if now you look at how that's impacting the vertical stratification, which is plotted on the lowermost panel, time on the x-axis, depth on the y-axis, You can see the strong stratification associated with the base of the mixed layer, but you do see that intermittently that stratification breaks down, and I've pointed out some of those regions there. And those also seem to be largely associated with the periphery of these mesoscale eddies. You can also see, as you look above that, the base of the mixed layer, you can see higher stratified waters in the mixed layer, suggesting that there's more vigorous exchange that happens between the interior and surface oceans in the high EKE and strain regions than you do see when you look at the downstream low EKE strain region. Now, for this study, we didn't actually, it's a fairly complicated data set, and we didn't actually go away and calculate carbon fluxes. But what we did do is we looked at how variance in apparent oxygen utilization anomalies, or so the AOU variance, on different density surfaces, which again here are mapped to depth, vary between the high EKE and low EKE regions. And again, you see the same sort of picture show up, where in the high eddy kinetic energy region, you have much higher variance, not just near the surface, but down to depths of at least 600 meters. And what we're proposing in this paper is that when you see increases in subsurface isopiconal tracer variance, they're associated with enhanced subduction in the Southern Ocean, and that this subduction happens in very localized regions. It tends to peak in regions where you have very strong frontogenesis, which can be shaped by mesoscale motions, and standing meanders in the Southern Ocean are one of the key places where this happens. Now, although it was not possible to directly calculate fluxes in this study, the results we're seeing from the observational side, the types of distributions we are seeing in terms of variance on different density surfaces, is very consistent with what very high resolution models are starting to see for the Southern Ocean. Maybe in the instant, just looking at the time, I'll just focus on the lower panels here. This is a nice study of a Southern Ocean-like channel model by Drew Ballward and colleagues, where they ran it at a range of different resolutions. You're seeing the 1 kilometer and 20 kilometer model simulations below. And then what they did was they painted the surface ocean with tracer and looked at the penetration of that tracer into the interior ocean and how that depended on model resolution. And as these models began to resolve submesoscale motions, even though those motions could act to actually re-stratify the upper ocean, it did lead to greater vertical flux and penetration of that tracer into the interior. And importantly, where those fluxes happened and where that exchange happened was in regions of high strain along the edges of mesoscale eddies, which again seems to be consistent with what we're seeing from the glider observations. Okay, so now I want to transition and just use my last sort of 5-6 minutes here to talk about a slightly different region. So we're now going to move to the subantarctic zone rather, of the Southern Ocean, this orange box south of Tasmania. And this was part of the Southern Ocean Large Aerial Carbon Export field program that was carried out in late 2020 and early 2021. So this is a region that has slightly weaker eddy kinetic energy. The study region I will talk about is located north of the polar front. So you can see the polar front here with these, where these contours are very tightly packed. These are sea surface height contours. Being north of the polar front, you have higher surface chlorophyll values, so you have larger potential for carbon export. And then we were working in a region around the Southern Ocean time series mooring location. I'm showing here the finite size Lyapunov exponent map for this around this period when we were sampling. And so you can see that this region, even though it is weaker eddy kinetic energy, it is characterized by having a number of coherent structures. So the C's and A's here are cyclonic and anticyclonic vortices. And then finally, on the right-hand side, I'm showing again the trajectory of the float, which is in the squares, colored as a function of time, and the glider position as well. And so what you found interestingly was that where we deployed the float, it did tend to follow a region of relatively high strain, sort of located on the edges of these coherent eddies. And we were able to use the glider to sort of sample across those eddies and across that high strain region. So just very quickly, what do those time series look like? So on the left, you can see the float as a function of time on the x-axis and depth or pressure on the y-axis. The float was sampling 12 hours and then 36 hours, so sort of roughly once per day. And by looking at both the temperature and salinity distributions and other properties, it was very clear that the float was indeed following a water mass. So it was largely a Lagrangian sampling platform. So you can see some warming happening at the surface. But in the interior, you largely see the same properties, and there's not much variability in the interior density. And you can contrast that on the right with what was seen by the glider, where you see lots of compensated temperature and salinity variations in the interior. You can see the signature of these mesoscale eddies through variations in the surface temperature properties. But again, you can see these very fine scale filaments that are not only in the surface, but penetrate relatively deep into the interior as well. And again, if you look at the density distribution from the glider, you can see that we were sampling across the edge of these mesoscale features due to the displacement in these different density surfaces here. And I should say that this structure that you see in the glider is there, even though the glider was never more than, say, a few tens of kilometers away from the float during most of the sampling. Okay, so for the last couple of slides here, I just want to show our estimate of the carbon export fluxes coming from the mixed layer pump and then coming from the eddy subduction pump. So on the top panel here, you have a time series, so time on the x-axis, of the mixed layer depth coming from the glider. The glider is sampling 5 to 6 times per day, so you have very high resolution of mixed layer depth variability. That's the black curve, then the red curve are daily means. So you can see during the sampling period, the mixed layer started relatively deep at about 100 meters. They shoal, but then there was some subsequent variations in that over time. We did capture the spring bloom. So you can see in the second panel here, peaks in the mixed layer POC that then start to die off over time. And then in the lower two panels, maybe just focusing on the lowermost panel, is our estimate of the export flux of carbon in grams of POC per meter squared per day, estimated in the third panel at daily timescales, and then estimated over a 5-day running mean. And so what you see is there are periods of coherent export. So when you have positive values of blue, that's mixed layer shoaling, and you have export. And over one 5-day period early in the time period, we had a mean rate of about 450 milligrams of POC per meter squared. But then that's compensated by sort of the subsequent mixed layer deepening. And if you average over that time series, then the mean over that time series is actually relatively weak. So you can have these very rapid shoaling events that export carbon, but at least in this region, they get re-entrained. Now, I should note we're making this estimate from the glider, and of course, the glider is not following a water mass, but we did the same calculation from the float and got largely the same results. So the very high frequency mixed layer depth variability that you get from the glider doesn't seem to impact this calculation very much, as long as you're averaging over a couple of days. Okay, and here's our estimate for the POC flux coming from the eddy subduction pump. On the left-hand side are all the time series you need to make this estimate, but I think just focusing on the panel on the right, you have time on the x-axis, the POC flux on the y-axis, and you can see that these fluxes are relatively large, so they're getting up to around a gram per meter squared per day, but just over very short intermittent time periods. Certainly only during the early part of this deployment for a period of a couple of weeks, associated with the spring bloom, do we see this strong, at least estimate of the POC flux from the eddy subduction pump, and then it dies off. But interestingly, even when we have these different peaks, they seem to be associated with slightly different regimes. So early in the deployment, we had deep mixed layers, which are typically associated with more vigorous submesoscale motions. But even around, so day -10 to -5 here, we estimate a strong eddy flux from the eddy subduction pump, even though the mixed layer is relatively shallow. And what we find is this is the period where we're sampling that very high strain region that has a very strong isopycnal tilt. And so what we think is that even though the exchange between the surface ocean and the interior might be weaker during this period, that strong isopycnal tilt allows you to have a relatively strong vertical velocity and thus vertical flux into the interior. Okay, and then the last slide I will show is actually trying to put these two flux estimates on the same time series, on the same figure. So, and again, the blue and the red here are the estimates of mixed layer pump export and re-entrainment, respectively. And then the eddy subduction pump, because it's always acting to restratify, always gives you this positive export flux. So the first thing to notice is that they are about the same magnitude. And then perhaps most importantly, we see periods of the eddy subduction pump being active during both times when the mixed layer is deepening and when it is shoaling. Now, I think we are working on a manuscript at the moment, it's currently in revision, that has some discussion about how does one work together to sort of add the mixed layer pump and the eddy subduction pump together. Are there times when their contributions should be canceling out? If you add them together, are you double counting? And I think there's still some work here to be done on sort of figuring out how to do that. And as I'm relatively short on time here, I probably won't go into a lot of the details. But what's key is that we really need to understand more about the vertical structure of the vertical velocity. That'll help us to sort of understand when can you do these simple estimates and sum the eddy subduction pump and the mixed layer pump? When should you sort of prefer or use estimates of one instead of the other? And I think that, the period where that's probably most relevant is when the mixed layer is deepening and the eddy subduction pump is active. Is the eddy subduction pump pushing that POC below the depth to which the mixed layer is deepening, in which case you could still expect to see a sort of a net export from that region. Okay, so I'm just about out of time, so I think I will stop there. I'll leave my conclusions up, and if there's time for questions, I would be happy to take them. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andy. Another excellent talk. Lots more to think about. So anybody who would like to ask any questions? We've got time for a few. So I ask one while we wait for other people to put their thoughts together. So it's very interesting. And I mean, I guess that they're not unrelated, but you have often quite a degree of heterogeneity in terms of the biology in the surface, gradients in POC. And you've demonstrated nicely that the different degrees of eddy kinetic energy and sort of the physical environment plays a big role in terms of, I guess, the effectiveness with which material can get to depth. Do you have any feel for the balance between those in terms of, whether it's roughly equal, or whether the physics tends to win out or the biology tends to win out?
In terms of the export flux, or setting the variability?
In terms of the export flux, if you're interested in how much is getting down there, is it something that's been largely driven by variability in the physics, variability in the biology, or is it as simple as the correlation between those two? If you've got high bio and high physical variability, then that tends to be the preferred way.
Well, I think that will certainly depend regionally. And I think one of the things that I didn't get to talk about here is that I think it's hard to simply sum those independently. There's another sort of regime that we looked at in the study where actually the sub-mesoscale types of vertical velocities that you typically associate with the stronger carbon flux were weaker. But there was a lot of tilt in the density surfaces associated with the mesoscale. And there seemed to be evidence that whether it was either just weak sub-mesoscales or just sinking into the interior ocean and then subsequent stirring along those density surfaces was actually helping to move, whether it's particulate matter, I mean, we were observing backscatter and oxygen concentrations, but move those water masses and those properties to deeper depths. And so I don't think it is always as simple as saying, this is a region where we expect the submesoscale to be stronger. Can we just add that on top of whatever the surface biology is doing to understand what the net export flux would be?
Okay. Yes, makes sense. Thank you. I can see that Marina's put a question in the chat. Marina, would you like to ask?
Sure. Hi, thanks, Adrian. Hi, Andy. I'm really glad that I finally get to see exactly what you've been estimating.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I was curious because of the different views on the eddy subduction pump. Yours is always positive, but when you think of it as, the effect of the vertical W's, they both go upward and downward. So when we estimate them from models directly, we've got compensations between the upward and downward pumps.
Right.
And so I was wondering if this like estimate that you have accounts for this compensation?
Yeah, so I think the thing to keep in mind, so you certainly know this well, but maybe for others, is that when we use the parameterization that we're doing here, we're sort of assuming that we're estimating over, as you mentioned, both these downwelling and upwelling motions, and that there's sort of a net effect that slumps the density surfaces. So sort of inherent in this assumption is that if you're getting a positive export flux, that there is more, say, if you think of it as POC, there's more POC in the surface ocean that's being carried down, and what's below the depth of the mixed layer or is lower down, that's being carried upward, has lower concentrations. And so it does seem that during this deployment, the POC, just vertical distribution of backscatter POC, was monotonic and monotonically decreasing downward. So I think this idea of there being a net downward flux makes sense. But certainly in regions where you could have subsurface maxima, then it's not always clear that flux always has to be downward. I don't think with the glider observations that we have that we are really able to necessarily capture both the downward and upward motions directly. But there are ways of actually attempting to estimate vertical velocities directly from the glider, and one could try and do that and multiply it directly to the observed POC concentrations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to have to wrap things up. I'm afraid we've just come to the end. Yeah. I say, as for Anne, please do contact Andy with any questions that you might have. I'm sure he would appreciate and be happy to respond. So that's it. Thank you again for joining the call. There will not be a call in September, but there will be one in August, hopefully, and we'll be putting out the dates for that soon. Otherwise, thank you once again to our excellent speakers, Anne and Andy. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Adrian.